Speaking of bloodthirsty maniacs, we most often recall Jack the Ripper, who was never found, or Andrei Chikatilo. However, in life, there are many examples of how the cunning and resourcefulness of the criminal, as well as the inaction of the authorities, have been the cause of numerous victims. According to psychologists, serial killers are individuals with serious mental disorders, often caused by childhood trauma or congenital conditions. We have decided to remember the most notorious serial killers of the 20th century. You may have seen the movie, It. So, the killer clown from this film had its own prototype. His name is John Wayne Gacy. The maniac worked as a clown at children's parties, for which he received his nickname. Moreover, he did not take money for his services. Gacy raped and murdered 33 teenagers and young adults between 1972 and 1978 in Chicago. He lured the victim to his home, promising money or work, and then strangled with a tourniquet. He buried 26 people in his yard. He disposed of the bodies of the next dead, dumping them into the Des Plaines River. Convicted of 33 murders, Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before being lethally injected on May 10, 1994. Despite all his disgusting and frightening essence, John Gacy managed to leave a legacy behind him. In addition to the mentioned prototype of Pennywise, the maniac went down in history as one of the most talented and skillful prison artists. And his paintings fully reflected the nature of all his actions, deeds and behavior, from the most terrible to the most ordinary. Harold Shipman was a physician in England and also one of the most massive serial killers in human history, with a proven track record of 250 murders. Being a professional, he was respected in his circle. However, colleagues and local residents began to express concern about the high death rate in the area, as well as the large number of signed forms for the cremation of older women. Some of the bodies were later exhumed and examination of the corpses showed the presence of diamorphine in them. It was later established that Shipman deliberately administered lethal doses of the drug to a huge number of patients. The judge sentenced him to 15 life terms without parole. In January 2004, Shipman hanged himself in his cell at Wakefield Prison. Barbosa was a Colombian serial killer known as the Mango Beast, who is believed to have raped and murdered over 150 young girls in Colombia and Ecuador in the 1970s and 1980s. He calmly confessed to the murder of 71 girls in Ecuador after escaping from a Colombian prison. The man led the police to the location where he had hidden the bodies of his victims. After raping the girls, he would kill them with a machete. Barbosa was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum penalty in Ecuador. In November 1994, he was killed in prison by a cousin of one of the deceased girls. Pedro Alonso Lopez is a Colombian serial killer who has been accused of raping and killing over 300 girls in South America. He preyed on young and vulnerable teenage girls in Peru, lured them to secluded places, raped them, and then killed them, most often by suffocation. Lopez was arrested when another attempt to kidnap a girl failed, and he was caught by market workers. He confessed to killing over 300 people. The police only believed him when, after a flash flood, they discovered a mass grave of many of his victims. In the end, 53 bodies were found. Detained in 1980, he spent only 18 years in prison. Then he was released from an Ecuadorian prison and deported to Colombia, where he was arrested again in 2002 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Pedro Rodrigues Filho is a serial killer from Brazil who was arrested in 1973 and convicted in 2003 of killing at least 71 people. Sentenced to 128 years in prison. He committed his first murder at the age of 14. He went against local drug dealers who killed his girlfriend while he was in jail for a series of thefts. At the age of 18, he already had 10 murders on his account. While in prison, he killed his father, who was also serving time for murder. While in prison, he killed 47 prisoners. Initially sentenced to 30 years in prison, Pedro extended his own term with his own hands, as against the backdrop of constant murders, his sentence was increased to 400 years in prison. Chikatilo was a Soviet serial killer known as the Rostov Ripper. Between 1978 and 1990, he raped and murdered at least 52 people, including women and children. Suspecting Chikatilo of the murders, the police conducted surveillance on him, which provided enough evidence for his arrest. He confessed to a total of 56 murders and was convicted of 53 of them in April 1992. Relatives of the victims demanded his release to carry out vigilante justice. Chikatilo was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad in February 1994. Another cruel maniac killer is Sergey Tkach. He himself claims that he has about 100 lives of teenage girls on his account. Law enforcement agencies were able to prove the rape and murder of only 27 girls. The most surprising thing is that Tkach himself worked as an investigator in the police. The killer was detained in his house in the town of Pologi, Zaporozhye region, Ukraine, in August 2005. Gary Leon Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, is an American serial killer who committed 48 confirmed murders of girls and women from 1982 to 1998. 2 decades later, his guilt was established through DNA analysis. He is one of the most infamous serial killers in America. Gary Ridgway was arrested in 2001 for 4 murders, although he confessed to committing at least 70 murders of women in the state of Washington in the 1980s and 1990s. He avoided the death penalty by providing detailed information to the police about the murders and leading authorities to the burial sites. He dumped the bodies of 5 women in the Green River, earning him the nickname, Green River Killer, in the press. He was convicted of 49 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Among the maniacs there are those who kill in order to then eat their victim. One of the most famous cannibal killers is Nikolay Dzhumagaliev, a serial killer and cannibal, also known as Iron Fang. This cannibal in 1980 lived in Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, where he worked as a laborer. He was charged with 47 murders, but guilt was proven only in 10 cases. Dzhumagaliev himself claimed that about 50 prostitutes were killed and eaten. From the meat of the murdered girls, he prepared various dishes and treated them to his friends. Sentenced to compulsory treatment in a psychiatric hospital of a strict type, where he is serving his sentence to this day. Speaking of homicidal maniacs, they usually imagine men. The image of a maniac is least of all associated with the image of a woman. Forensic science knows many examples of bloody killers, women who are not inferior to men in cruelty. The Black Widow is considered the most brutal female killer of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Her name is Belle Sorenson Gunness. With her help, about 40 people were sent to another world. More than half of all those killed are relatives or close friends of the widow. The woman did not work. She existed at the expense of insurance, which she received after the death of her relatives. She killed her husband, children, and several potential suitors. The exact circumstances of her death remain unknown. A decapitated and charred body of a woman who could have been Belle Sorenson Gunness did not provide 100% certainty that it was indeed the Black Widow. Jane Toppan, born Honora Kelly, is an American serial killer. In 1901 she confessed to 31 murders. She explained her crimes by the desire to commit the largest number of murders in history. Nurse Jane Toppan attacked infirm patients. It is known that her father was crazy, so Jane was brought up in an orphanage. The girl was adopted, but the adoptive parents turned out to be poor, because of which the anger of the future killer towards others only intensified. At first, Nurse Toppan administered drugs to her patients, observing their condition between life and death. From this she received the strongest sexual pleasure. Later, the woman transformed her experiments into murders. After her arrest, the police were able to prove 11 murders. While under arrest, the nurse confessed to 31 more murders. The examination proved that Jane is insane. She spent the rest of her life in a psychiatric clinic. Sexual, serial, murders share common characteristics that are always linked to the perpetrator's intimate life, their psychologically traumatizing sexual experiences, and their feelings of sexual inadequacy and deficiency. These shared traits are what allow these murders to be classified as sexual. In the lives of these killers, there were significant failures in their sexual experiences, and for the vast majority, genuine sexual catastrophes, meaning they did not succeed as men. For example, Chikatilo was impotent, Golovkin, who killed 12 boys and adolescents, and Urshov, who hacked 4 women with an axe, were virgins, and the cannibal killer Dzhumagaliev had a strong aversion to sexual intercourse, and so on. In short, almost all serial sexual killers were sexual failures or felt themselves to be as such.